Many of you may have picked up the outline of the presentation coming in. There are a few changes. I'll point them out as I go through. Nothing substantive has been added or deleted, but I did put in a couple of bells and whistles that I thought would be interesting. So this is a group talking all about prevention and HIV prevention, obviously, and part of HIV prevention involves vaccines. And it involves also biobehavioral approaches, microbicides, risk reduction, all sorts of modalities. But at AIDS Research Alliance, we're primarily, although we've done some biobehavioral studies, we're primarily interested in medical interventions for prevention. And so that primarily involves for us vaccine studies, and we've been involved in every phase 2 or 3 large vaccine study that's ever been conducted, beginning quite a long time ago. So, with all the other stuff, why do we need an HIV vaccine? This is probably obvious; you all know this, but around the world, one of the statistics that's put out is that for every 2 people put on treatment, 5 more become infected. So that means we're not going to treat our way out of this disease. So the idea that we can get everyone on and less people will become infected because people are being treated, that doesn't seem to be what's happening. It's outpacing our ability to fight it. There's been some leveling off and some slight improvement, but there still will remain access to treatment, health systems, and the general austerity politics going around the world are making it a lot more difficult for both donor countries and recipients of aid. The other thing is that no infectious disease of this magnitude has ever been stopped without a vaccine. So if you think about all the things that have plagued mankind, polio, smallpox, vaccines were the only thing that actually enabled us to conquer those diseases. As you know, in several urban areas, HIV is as high as, for men having sex with men, is as high as 30%. I'm sure you all have seen this this slide from Los Angeles Department of Health, probably multiple times, but basically it points out that the rate of diagnosis for LA County is 28.5, which is just under the threshold needed to reach this highest level of greater than or equal to 30. So obviously here we're very, very impacted by continuing new infections, and despite all of our best efforts on multiple fronts to try to prevent transmission. This is another slide that I thought was just interesting, pointing out that if you actually look at some of the cities in the United States, New York City, men having sex with men, African-American men in Washington, D.C., the rates actually is higher than some African nations. So we know that depending on your ethnicity, your rate of becoming infected and the rate per 100,000 varies quite widely from African-Americans to Hispanic, and the epidemic is moving from one population into another. And in fact, we're there's a large amount of people at risk, and still MSM, it's fairly rampant there. So this is actually a map of the ethnicity and race in Los Angeles. This is from the census data from 2010. I pulled from Eric Fisher, who does a lot of these maps. He chose the colors. The white dots each represent 50 people. And each dot represents 50 people. The red dots represent people who identify as Caucasian. The blue dots identify people who are African American. The Hispanic community is identified by the yellow dots, and the green are the Asian. And it's actually very interesting to look at this because you can see this picture in 2000 and 1990, and what you're seeing is that all the edges are blurring. In terms of people relocating and becoming less and less ghettoized and throughout the population. This is actually a little bit of a challenge for those of us who do risk reduction, because we can't approach just one community in one area and another community in a different area. As people become more diverse, we really needs to be multifocal no matter where we are. This is where AIDS Research Alliance is now located. We moved from West Hollywood, which is, right about here. You've got UCLA is actually over here. We've moved downtown, so we're kind of at the intersection where a lot of the epidemic is going, and that has been very helpful for us in terms of recruitment, as you'll see in our recruitment numbers for one of the studies. This is all very good in terms of our social programs and our getting along with everybody, but it also makes it a little bit difficult to target precisely the populations that we want. We can't just go out to West Hollywood and think we're going to get all of the population that we want. Okay, so why the hell is it taking so long to get an HIV vaccine? I mean, there's a famous quote of one of the people standing behind President Clinton, and the woman who was the head at that time said, "Oh, we'll have a vaccine in 3 years." And I'm sure that she cringes every time someone shows that clip, because we're now quite a long period of time past that, and we don't actually have a vaccine. So this is just to put it in a little bit of perspective in terms of how long it takes to develop a vaccine. Typhoid, 105 years. Pertussis, whooping cough. I mean, it's been around a long time, 90 years. Interesting thing about that is we thought we had a great vaccine, and we wanted to tweak it and make it even better, and now we're finding out it's not actually working as well as we thought it did. So they're thinking about going back to the older vaccine. Polio, 50 years. Measles, hepatitis B, that was actually pretty quick at 15 years. So vaccine development takes a very long period of time. Part of the issue with that is that in order to test a vaccine, you actually have to give a vaccine to a large number of people, give a placebo to a very large number of people, and then it's not ethical to go around and start exposing people to things. You can't just, expose everyone to pertussis and see who doesn't catch it. So you basically have to allow nature to take its course. So these studies are very large studies. Some of the other studies are 1,500 people. The one we're involved with now is 2,500 people. So to recruit 2,500 people and follow them for 2 years, we're actually at the 4th year of the study that we're in. The people are just beginning to enter. They will finish in 2 years, which means from the time the first patient was recruited to the time the last patient finishes the study is 6 years. That's just for one study. And then they've got to clean the data, and they've got to do the analysis and all that time. So it's not something where, for example, you can take major depression and do a study in a fairly short period of time on a couple hundred people, or even an antibiotic. These are very large studies, and in essence, they're almost similar to epidemiological type research, because they just involve large populations and long periods of time. There have been success stories, and this is just shows the peak prevalence for many of the diseases that have plagued mankind. So, the peak for pertussis was prior to World War II. Polio was prior to a couple years before I was born. Smallpox was before World War I, but for some of these, there have been no cases of polio or smallpox in the modern era, at least up to 2007. Diphtheria as well, and so there have been success stories with vaccines. Okay, so to date, there have been several studies that have already been done in HIV vaccines. And the first one was VaxGen. And I don't know if anyone remembers, but the study started in 1999 and went till 2003. AIDS Research Alliance was actually one of the third and highest enrolling site. It took us about a year to screen 400 people and get 203 into the study. And it was a study using a subunit vaccine, AIDS-Vax. And I'll show you the results of that study. The next large study was the Merck, what's known as the STEP study. This was a more scientifically advanced vector where they use one virus to deliver HIV genes, which then the body makes into proteins, and it's seen as foreign. So you basically get a vaccine that way. It's kind of initially was, people thought it was a better way of going. It's more scientific. It's as opposed to a lot of our old vaccines where you just try to kill kill the virus and give it to people, and the FDA decided because HIV is inevitably fatal that you would need 8 logs of killing power. So you would basically have to make sure that there was less than 1 in like 100 billion live viruses, and that's almost impossible to do. You have to use two techniques to do that, and so we had to move towards these kinds of vectors. And then the RV144 study that was completed, which was the Thai study, went from October to July of 2006, and the results were in 2009. And this actually, this was a study of mild to moderate risk patients. So since we didn't really have risk patients in this particular study, they had to enroll 16,000 patients. And this actually used what we call a prime boost. It actually used 2 different vaccines. And then the current study, which is 505, began in 2009. And originally it was looked at to see whether it could just reduce viral load. And then later it was changed to a preventative study. Okay, so what are the results of the previous HIV vaccine studies? So this is the VaxGen. And these are the top-line results, what we call the top-line results of the study. In that, if you look at the efficacy results between people who got placebo or vaccine, the vaccine was had at most a 4% effectiveness rate, which means that but it basically wasn't scientifically valid at all. And so this study was a total failure. There was one subgroup that did appear to, perhaps to get some benefit, and that was African Americans and Asian Pacific Islanders. But these numbers were very, very small, and they were kind of poo-pooed. And I had kind of forgot about this data until I put this presentation together, and it made me think a little bit about what happened in the Thai trial a little bit later in terms of different groups. But the study was a total bust. Everyone got depressed. We did learn something very useful, though, and in a lot of prevention studies, one of the big risks or points of controversy is if you put people in a vaccine study, everyone's going to run around and go to the bathhouse because they got a sore arm and they think they're protected, and so their risk behavior is going to increase. The same thing is going to be said and is said about PrEP, pre-exposure prophylaxis, post-exposure prophylaxis, all of these kinds of things. But it actually turns out that in this study and in every subsequent study, what we've seen is that risk behavior in the population goes down. So unprotected anal sex went down, as well as unprotected anal sex with a HIV partner. And it pretty much went down and stayed down through the course of the study. So we learned how to do an HIV study. We learned that it didn't cause the horrible things we thought. We also learned that VaxGen, the AIDS vaccine, at that point, it didn't seem like it did anything. It didn't work. Okay, so then we come up to the previous HIV vaccine study called the STEP study. And this study was started originally to prevent HIV infection and to reduce the amount of HIV in the blood, and of course, like all studies, to see if it's safe and well tolerated. And the trial design was initially, and this I think is kind of interesting, initially they put 1,500 patients in the study who had relatively low antibodies to the vector. The thinking at that time was if people have antibodies to the vector and we give this to them, their antibodies are going to prevent the vaccine from actually working very well. So let's only put people in who have low AD5, what we call AD5 titers, or low pre-existing antibodies to this AD5 virus, which is a common cold virus, which half of us in this room have had. So in Los Angeles, about 50% of the people don't get in the study because they have AD5 virus. But initially, as I said, they started with just lower groups of people. Then there was some work done on people who had higher levels of AD5, and it looked like their response was okay. So they tended to respond to the vaccine, they tended to make antibodies, and they tended to do very well. And so the people, the scientists who, like myself, we think we know what we're doing all the time, they decided, oh, okay, this is okay now, it's safe. Let's increase the study and include people who have high levels of antibody. And so the study then added another 1,500 people with high levels of antibody. So the study was changed in the middle, and it basically had people with a wide spectrum of antibodies to the vector. So the primary hypothesis in the subset of people who had less than 200, a titer of 200 of antibodies to add 5, which is very low, was to decrease the viral set point and also decrease HIV acquisition, or in other words, prevent people from getting infected. And the secondary hypothesis later was the same as the primary. Okay. This is the top line results of that study. And this slide always comes out a little bit hard to read, so I have to go take you through it a little bit. Basically, in this kind of a graph, every time someone becomes infected in a group, there's a notch up. And this is the number of HIV people infected. And this is time along the bottom. And so you basically take the two groups, and these are people who received the vaccine. And every time someone who received the vaccine got infected, there was a notch up. So, for example, here there were like 6 people got infected around this time. No one got infected for about a month. Then one person got infected. Then no one got infected for like a month. And then 2 people got infected, and no one. And then 2, and then a whole bunch got infected, etc. And these are the people who got placebo. These are the people who did not get the vaccine. This is not good. So this study was stopped, and this was kind of a shock to everybody because actually, if you look at the overall top line, what we call the top line results, this vaccine actually made people more likely to become infected. We did not anticipate that. And so the studies, the conferences I went to afterwards, they were handing out Prozac like crazy because everyone involved in vaccine research was really set for a loop because this was totally unanticipated. But we're going to see that's kind of the history of vaccine research in this field. But what we did learn when we looked a little bit closer is that if people had low levels of antibodies, less than 200, there was really no difference between the vaccine and placebo. And for people who had less than 18, which is actually the cutoff, there was absolutely no difference. This is not actually statistically significant. So it turns out that the problem in this particular study was that the people who had lots of antibodies to HIV, to the AD5, were the ones most likely to become infected. And this is the subgroup analysis of the people who had the most amount of AD5. And you can see the big difference between this. This is kind of given the fact that they actually amended the study to allow people in with high levels of AD5 and having this result, this was quite a shocker for everybody. Okay, so then everyone went back to the drawing board. There were some large studies, including the 505 study we're doing now that was basically cut in half. They decided it was not going to be a study to prevent infection. It was going to be a study just to look at viral load. And everyone was going around looking at how to move forward in the field. We don't really know what's going on. And then in the meantime, a group of people came out with the TIE results. And the TIE results basically looked at a combination of 2 different kinds of vaccines. And so they looked at the AIDS vax. And this AIDS vax was the first vaccine I showed you that didn't do anything. It was the one that had like 3.8% with a p-value of 0.86. It did absolutely nothing. And this other one, which was based on a bird kind of flu, also in a study by itself did absolutely nothing. And when they proposed this study, there was a large article in Science, which is like, the Bible of the research world, saying, don't do this study, it's a waste of time, neither of these things have worked, it's not going to work. And it was signed by the prominent scientists in the vaccine field and in the field of HIV, who said, don't do this study. Well, they were wrong, because this is the first study where they began to show a vaccine that worked. This is a little bit hard to see, but in this case, the people who got vaccinated is actually the lower line, which is what we want. We don't want the people getting vaccinated up at the higher line. And so when they looked at, these are different ways of looking at the protocol, it looked like there was about 30 some odd percent reduction in infection, and most of that appeared to be perhaps as high as 45% if you looked at the early part of the study. It tended to drift off after this initial protection. It didn't look like it got any more. It didn't seem to do as much. So this is the first study where they began to look at, began to see a result. So NIH was in the middle of starting the 505 study. It was being started with a certain number of people, and they were going to look at just at viral load, and then this comes out. And so this prompted a reinvigoration of the field. And fortunately, they had enough blood to start looking at what seemed to work in the Thai study. What was it in the people's blood that seemed to predict who was going to be protected? And so the major researchers in these particular areas looked at all of these different variables, whether IgA is a kind of antibody that you actually secrete in your mucous membranes and things like that. So they thought, well, maybe the people who had mucous membrane antibodies were the ones protected. These other people looked at whether the antibody, how strong it bound to GP120, which is the outside. Other people looked at cellular immunity. There was a whole bunch of things. There was actually a list of 20 or 25 things that they began looking at, and a consensus arose that these would be the ones that they looked at. And sure enough, they began to see what were the things that would predict whether that combination of AIDS-Vax plus Alvac would work. And what you can see here is that if you had high binding to, and this is actually unusual because we thought it would be the V3 loop. If you had high binding to the V1, V2 loop, your risk was less. It was about half. But once again, as opposed to what we thought would happen, if you actually have antibodies in your mucus, your risk was higher. So here, once again, this is like the third or fourth time in vaccine research where it's kind of overturned the conventional wisdom that you need antibodies and that these would be help. And it turns out that these antibodies actually prevent these ones from attaching. So we did learn something from this third study, which brings us to the study that's now going on. So it's HVTN 505. We are studying, because of all the prior data, in the Merck study, there weren't very many women. So we're only studying men and male to female transgenders. 80 to 50, they have to be HIV negative, obviously, and they have to be circumcised because of the prior data on the other study. So they actually have to be fully circumcised. What I didn't realize, even though I thought I would, is that 30% of people who think they're circumcised are not fully circumcised. So there's still a good amount of skin that can be pulled over the head of the penis that has the mucosa where a virus can enter. So we actually have to check everyone to make sure that the scar from the circumcision is right underneath the glands and it's not any further down. So that's one of the first things we check. And of course, they can't have any antibodies to the vector that's being used. They get 4 shots over 6 months. Why 4 shots over 6 months? We don't really know. Every vaccine study seems to be baseline 1 month, 3 months, and then maybe 6 or 12. There's no really good data that says one or the other, but we all kind of agree that a booster should be given at least at 1 month, and so everyone seems to follow this kind of a plan, but no one can really say that this is any better than 4 shots over 12 months or 3 shots over 9 months or whatever. Patients are followed every 3 months. A little bit unusual is that normally in a study, when you get to a certain point, the statisticians look at the data. This time, the statisticians are looking at the data after every single infection to make sure that you don't have this separation occurring that's showing harm to the patients. And so this is a little bit unusual. So it's a lot of safety. This, of course, this is one issue. People will have, if they get the vaccine, they will have what we call VISP, or vaccine-induced seropositivity. In the other vaccine studies, we didn't use envelopes. So it was very easy to tell that someone was in a vaccine study because when you look at the Western blot, the first thing you make antibodies to is your envelope. The first thing the body sees is the outside of the virus. And there's 3 proteins, or 3 parts there, GP120, GP41, and GP160. And so, you have to have those antibodies in order to be positive. So vaccines originally didn't have an envelope. So you could look at the Western blot and say, oh, this person's not infected because there's no envelope. But now, these new vaccines are using envelopes. So it's more difficult to tell using antibody tests. So this becomes more and more of a problem. And the NIH has set up a system whereby after the study is over, if you decide to move to Podunk, Nebraska, and you need your special HIV test, you'll be able to call up and they will arrange for it through LabCorp, and they're going to get another one as well. And this will be a lifetime thing. Okay, so we did community education. I'm going to skip this a little bit because of the time. So the challenges, add 5. As I said, 49% at Los Angeles, 49% of the population have add 5 titers, so they're automatically excluded. It's one of the first things we look for. Circumcision is another issue. Medi-Cal stopped paying for circumcision in like 1962 or something like that. So a lot of people who had that service are not circumcised. And then people coming from other countries, a lot of them are not circumcised as well. So that eliminates a large number of people. Then we have the challenge of vaccine-induced seropositivity. People freak out. We still have cases where, now it's automatic that you test someone for HIV. You break your arm, you go to the emergency room, they got it put in pins. They send you to the OR. They automatically, don't even ask you anymore. They automatically test you for HIV unless you tell them, don't test me, because otherwise they're going to think you're positive. And it just causes a mess. It's now got names reporting. It's a whole big thing. So we have to do a lot of education about what we call VISP. There's a lot of misinformation and lack of awareness. It's a lot different than when we started. So this is the vaccine regimen. The top one is what's being done in the current study. There are 2 different vaccines. We're using a DNA plasmid at this point, and then the adeno vector here. Whereas the STEP study that had the bad results, these were all adeno. It was one vaccine type. So how do we describe the differences between these kinds of vaccines? And this is kind of a lame picture, but it really works. I couldn't come up with anything better, but this is what they provided. So a vaccine has a delivery system, and that's what we call our vector. And so it's kind of like a little postman, and what he's doing is he is delivering genes to a person, and these genes are then made into proteins, and it teaches the body how to better fight an infection. So in the STEP study, what they did was they used the recombinant Ad5, and it delivered GAG, Nef and Pol, and it was the recombinant. It was deactivated, and there was no envelope in this particular study. In the study that we're currently doing now, it is delivering, well, first of all, what they've done is they have hampered the Ad5 vector, which is shown here by the guy not having a leg, or here it's even more hampered. So basically what they're doing is they're trying to make less of a chance that if you have any antibodies that you'll react to the vector, so to avoid the problem. And then the plasmid delivers these particular genes, including envelope, and then the other one delivers, this is a vector, it's very truncated. There's very little of the Ad5 left, and it delivers this. So, okay, that didn't come out. So there have been a lot of influences on HVTN, the STEP study on the eligibility criteria, the fact that you have people have to be fully circumcised, they can't have any evidence of prior Ad5 infection. There's an unusual and high level of monitoring. The eligibility is more narrow. It doesn't include women, so it's a little bit more difficult. So this is actually our results so far. We have 100 well, what I wanted to show on the slide that the numbers didn't come out is that overall, in order to get one person enrolled, we have to create 76 contacts, which means we have to create enough information so that 76 people give us either their phone number, their email address, or something. So 76 people for every person in. And so far we have slightly over 100. So we're talking a large number of contacts that are created. In the first study we did in VaxGen, it only took us 423 people to get our 203. So, we only had to create twice as many contacts. In the second study we did, it took about 800 people to get the 100 people. Now, it's taking 7,000 people in order to get the 100 that we need. So this is an ongoing challenge. Part of it has to do with the Ad5, part of it has to do with the circumcision, but a lot of it has to do with there's a lot of loss of interest. People think they can take meds and they don't have to worry about it, and people aren't as excited about a vaccine. But anyway, this is the results of. These are all the different sites. There are 21 HVTN sites across the country. And this is actually a combination of totaling the percentage of African American, Hispanic, and multiracial subjects by site. And this is the Los Angeles site here. So the fact that we're located where we're located really has helped us get a very broad population, which is over 60% minority. Which I think is a kind of an achievement, and my staff over there should be patting themselves on the back. But there are some future challenges, both for our particular study and for vaccine research in general. So scientifically, there are a lot of scientific issues that are coming up in terms of what vector to use. We're still figuring out how long between various injections should take place. It looks like anything that's going to happen is going to require probably lifelong boosting. We're tending to see that more with vaccines. If any of you work in the medical field, before you go to the hospital, they test your antibodies to measles that you had or from your measles vaccine, because it wears off by the time you hit 20. We're seeing that now. They're recommending that women get pertussis again when they hit 20, and all sorts of populations where vaccines are wearing off. So there are a lot of scientific challenges. There are recruitment challenges, as I noted. It's getting more and more difficult to get the people into the study and to maintain their interest. So it's, the days where you could have one person working part-time, placing a couple ads, doing a little bit of recruitment here and there, those days are over. It really requires a really extensive team of outreach. Then coming into the picture, we've got new modalities to prevent infection, like PrEP. So if PrEP becomes very predominant, the main effect on vaccine trials, it will take a much larger number of people in the vaccine trial to show the improvement of a vaccine over PrEP. So if our study here required 22,500 to show an effect, if 10% of the people start using PrEP, the number goes up to about 4,000 that are required in the study. If 20% of people start using PrEP and it's evenly distributed, we start talking about numbers in 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 participants. So there are some people who think that once PrEP goes through the U.S. and if it becomes very, the uptake is very high, then it may become logistically almost impossible to do a vaccine study in the United States. Vaccine studies may need to be, the phase 2B and phase 3, the later studies may need to be done overseas. And of course, then that brings in financial. Everyone knows we're in austerity everywhere. Here, Europe, there's a lot of cutbacks in terms of science, and the HVTN, the ACT AIDS Clinical Trials Group, the Microbicides Trials Network, the Prevention Trials Network, the Infant and Maternal Trials Network, all of these networks just finished our competition for recompetition for the next 7 years. So we went in with UCLA as part of to be the HVTN, but the number of sites for HVTN is probably going to be decreased from 21 to perhaps as little as 6 or 7. So, so my last point is here. This is Los Angeles County, and this is actually other cities that are superimposed. And each of these cities has a HVTN site or an ACTG site. And if you actually look at the distribution of all of these cities, it would be a real shame if down the future Los Angeles didn't have a microbicide site, an HVTN site, an ACTG site, because given our population and the expanse, we certainly do deserve one, as well as each of these others. New York City has 2 HVTN sites. So that's my little pitch for supporting prevention research and making sure that Southern California is well represented. I think that's it. These are some resources we have. I Believe in the V is a website we put up. There's a video that is part of the informed consent process that's there. Hope Takes Action is the national site. There are bridging organizations. We're working with APLA, which was what we call our NEVRI partner. And now there's the Beta Generation partner, and we're working with Vienna Star. And actually, they're the ones who helped arrange me to come talk at this meeting. And of course, you've got IAVI. I think that's it.